try to compare and contrast different types of mechanics, different types of maintenance you're going to do on your truck. So if I had to rate the mechanics in order, as how good are they? I would say number one mechanics that's best for your truck is a Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic. Now, like, why is Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic? What's so big deal about that? Well, these are top-notch mechanics. They are mechanical experts. That's their expertise, is Detroit Diesel, engines. So they're often factory trained. They're certified, which means they're tested on their knowledge and their skill sets, and their development. And so they have to get certification and they have to maintain certification. And the way a Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic works on your truck is they typically go by a procedure, a quality control system that they have to follow. They have a book, a maintenance book, a troubleshooting book, and they got to go through them steps, step by step by step by step, and they cannot deviate. This is part of the certification process. So when that repair is completed, it's guaranteed. And that guarantee is a national 1 year warranty on that repair or in that part. And so for an over-road truck driver, that's really the best warranty you can get, because if you get the repair done in Dallas and then you have that same breakdown in Atlanta, you take your truck into a Freightliner or a Detroit Diesel shop in Atlanta and they will cover it under warranty. And that's very, very important. Compare that to a local shop that might be good, might not, but often a local shop isn't certified. They don't go by the book. They just go by the seat of their pants. They just make stuff up. And they don't give you a national warranty. Oftentimes, the local shop will give you a 30-day warranty. You're like, well, if it breaks, you got to bring it back here. Well, that doesn't do you any good as an over-the-road truck driver, because I guarantee you, if it breaks again, it won't break within 30 miles of that shop. So, that right there, that's a deal killer for me. It's like I got to have that warranty. So, Detroit Diesel would be the best mechanics, and I put some links in the description. For Stewart and Stevenson, they're Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic shop, and Interstate Power Systems, they're another Detroit Diesel shop. And you want to look for a Detroit Diesel logo when you go to a new shop you've never been to before, or call them ahead of time and ask them if they're Detroit Diesel certified. So that would be very, very important. If I had a breakdown, I'm on the side of the road, the first place I'm looking is, where's the nearest Freightliner? The second place I'm looking is, where's the next Detroit Diesel service location? Because sometimes you're in the middle of nowhere and Freightliner might be 500 miles away. That's kind of far, to take your truck for repairs. However, if I look for a Detroit Diesel certified shop, they might be within 100 miles, and they're just as good. The mechanics are just as good. So that's what I do. Is whenever possible, I go Detroit Diesel certified. And there's some things that you would only want the best mechanics to do repairs on your truck. Like if it's covered under your extended warranty, your Daimler EN4 warranty, you're gonna want the Detroit Diesel certified mechanics to work on their truck, because that it's going to be covered under warranty. So that would be anything with the after treatment system. Most parts on the engine, like your fuel pump, your water pump, things like that, would be covered under the extended warranty. So you really want to get that Detroit Diesel certified shop. Now, there's some cases where you don't need to take your truck into the most expensive mechanic. Detroit Diesel is not cheap. These guys are charging over $200 an hour, so, and they charge by the line item, so if you got other things to do, like say you need new wipers, you want new engine air filter, cabin air filter, you want an oil change, you want your tires rotated, those things can go to a lesser qualified mechanic, because that's routine preventative maintenance. Those are PMs, and I would go to any Crete location and have them do that. They're okay for doing that, but if it's something more complex, like say an overhead valve adjustment, or I need a new fuel injector, I'm going to Freightliner, or I'm going to a Detroit Diesel shop. I'm not letting the Crete mechanics touch my truck for something more complex. So, we talked about Freightliner, Detroit Diesel, and we talked briefly about the Crete mechanics. What other mechanics are out there? Well, there's the guys at the truck stops, the TA, the Petro, the Loves, and Southern Tire Mart. Um, for the most part, those are probably the least qualified mechanics, that are out there. A lot of times, those guys who are working at truck stops were probably delivering pizzas a month ago, and now they're working on your $100,000 truck. And that's a problem. It's a problem for me. And it's like, well, if you had $100,000 Mercedes personal vehicle, would you let one of these mechanics touch that Mercedes? Probably not. So why are you letting them touch your $100,000 Freightliner? $100,000 is $100,000. Let's see some of the comments. I know I could get comments on this. Let me see if I can read some of these. So what kind of mechanic do you recommend for something like replacing intake and injector? Yeah, I would get a Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic for that. If it's above and beyond a routine preventive maintenance item, I would be looking for a Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic. Um, I wouldn't fool around with these lesser mechanics. There's different skill levels. And the guys at the terminals, they work hard. There's no doubt about it. But they're not at the same skill level as the guy at Freightliner. The terminals, at the big box carriers, and I think it's true for all the carriers, they generally hire students straight out of diesel tech school, and they get their experience working at these big box carriers, and they do like entry level type of maintenance. So they work hard, and there's no doubt about it. They'll do brakes, they'll do shocks, they'll rotate your tires, they'll do a lot of smaller, lesser function things, but they're not going to do injectors. They're not going to do engine work. So and then if you look at the guys at the truck stop, I think they're the lowest on the rung. Sometimes the mobile mechanics are really good. The only limitation on mobile mechanic is, whatever tools they have in their truck. So sometimes I broke down on the side of the road. Before I go to Freightliner or Detroit Diesel, I will find a mobile mechanic. I will do that. So someone's saying something about English. No. I don't know what that is. All right. So there are different skill levels, different types of mechanics, different cost levels associated with these truck repairs. So I would say the ranking from highest to lowest. Highest would be Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic and or Freightliner. Next highest, I would say mobile mechanics. They're really, really good depending where you're at. Then I would go by reputation on local shops. Some guys swear by the local mechanics. They will have local mechanics that take care of them. There's like, I know, for example, there's a shop near South Dallas called Redneck Diesel Performance. I'll give a shout out to those guys. They did good work for me once before, and they work on all makes and models of trucks. And those guys are really, really good. But I don't think they're Detroit Diesel certified, so they wouldn't come with warranty. So you can find local shops, but they won't have the warranty. And then I would say the mechanics at the terminals are probably the next in line, and then the bottom pole is the truck stop mechanics. They're really bad. I've had truck stop mechanics change a water pump on my truck before, And then I went to Detroit Diesel afterwards, had them inspect it, and they put on the wrong water pump. So it cost me $800 at truck stop, and then I had to pay another $800 at Detroit Diesel. So if you make a mistake, then you end up paying twice, because you paid for the crappy mechanic to do it in the first place, and then you got to pay the Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic to correct their work, and that's a problem. I've done a oil change at Love's before, and they put in the wrong fuel filter. So then I get to the shipper, and my truck won't start. Well, it lost its pressure, fuel pressure, and I called Love's. I had sent out a mobile mechanic and bring me the right fuel filter. So I haven't had good luck with the truck stop mechanics, although every once in a while you'll find a good one. I had a good one near Nashville, and he worked on my air conditioning, and he was able to fix it. But by the most part, they're not that great. They probably haven't been a mechanic very long, and those guys have high turnover at truck stops. They're at the bottom of the rung as far as I'm concerned. So when you talk about mechanics, it's always a good discussion between owner operators, like, where'd you go for truck repairs, how much did it cost, did it come with a warranty, things like that. And something that owner operators love to talk about. They love to talk about their breakdowns, the repairs, the mechanics. But I would say, try not to pinch pennies when it comes to truck repairs, because you really get what you pay for. So if you had the choice between taking your truck to Freightliner or taking it to the terminal, and it wasn't, let's say it was a fault code, for example, you may be better off going to Freightliner, because those guys will be the most highly trained mechanics out there, and they will get to the bottom of that fault code. You got to remember that at Freightliner, for example, they see tens of thousands of trucks a year, and they know, based on their computer network across the country, what's going on with these trucks. Because your Cascadia is no different than someone else's Cascadia, and these fault codes all get put in the computer, and they all have repair procedures associated with it. So that they will go by the fault code, and they will fix it right the first time. If you get a lesser mechanic, you may be screwing around with that repair, going back and forth. Guy can't fix it. I had my 2012 was an old 10-speed manual transmission. I had it up to 1,000,000 miles, which I don't recommend. Don't ever do that. These trucks, once they get above 700, 800,000 miles, they nickel dime you to death. They break down for everything. All those parts are aging, and it shows. That you can't keep an old truck on the road. So the transmission went out. I got towed, and the tow truck company had a garage, and I had a choice to go to Freightliner, but I like, what? This is a mechanical issue. These guys should be able to do it, and they can get me in and out quicker. And I was like, well, we'll give them an opportunity here to work on my truck. How can they possibly screw this up? Well, they did. They put in the wrong clutch. They put in a remanufactured transmission, which was all right, and gave me a 30-day warranty and sent me on my way. Well, it was wrong clutch, and then it fried the new transmission, and then they had to come get me, because I had picked up a load of canned soup, and it was maximum weight, and that transmission fried. That clutch did not hold up. So then they got another transmission, and then another clutch. They put that in my truck, and now I'm in a hotel room for 10 days, and I'm losing, several $100s per day that I'm in the hotel room, and I got to pay for this truck repair. And then when they were done, I took my truck to Detroit Diesel Certified Shop, had them inspect the work, and yep, they put in the wrong clutch a second time. So then I had to pay Detroit Diesel to put in the correct clutch. So these are some of the challenges you come in, with these lesser shops, lesser mechanics. They don't do the job correctly. They take longer. You think you get in and out quicker, but you know these mechanics aren't that great. Your expectations are too high, and they will cost you money because you're waiting. And they won't have a warranty. So I won't do that again. That was a $10,000 mistake. So you think about these mechanics. You can make a mistake. You can hire the wrong mechanic for the job. You expect the guy at Love's to do an engine overhaul. That's not going to happen. They have limitations. And you got to be careful too, because just because the shop or the mechanic says they can do the job, they could be lying through their teeth. They don't have any experience on that job. They're going to get it on your truck. Do you want them to, first time they ever done something, to do it on your truck? Like, no. You have to protect your truck. That's like, there's certain mechanics, I won't let them touch my truck. There's certain terminals, certain shops, no way. I'm not letting them touch my truck. I was like, I don't even want them to look at my truck. That's how bad they are. Other mechanics, I'll let them do, they have a reputation. They've done good work for me in the past. I'll let them do, a little bit more, a little bit more. I reward good mechanics with repeat business, and I'll punish poor mechanics by taking my business somewhere else. So it's tough. You got a budget for repairs. You got your maintenance accounts, and it's very, very expensive. You just want the job done correctly. If I have to pay more to get the Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanic, but I have full confidence in the repair and the warranty, then that's what I'm going to do. So I think the other thing with local shops, you got to understand how they make their profit. With a local shop, just like Joe's Diesel Repair, he's buying cheap knockoff parts. Where Freightliner, Detroit Diesel only use OEM parts, original equipment manufactured parts. They only use the best parts. The local garage is probably going to use an aftermarket part that costs half as much. Probably made in China, probably not as good a part. So they're cutting corners on the quality of parts, and they're not paying their mechanics the higher rate that Freightliner is. These guys who work at a local shop often were rejected by Freightliner or a Detroit Diesel certified shop. They weren't good enough to get hired by the big boys. So they take a job at a local shop, and they're not being paid. They're not the highest qualified mechanics. So you're not getting the best labor, and you're not getting the best parts, and you're not getting the best warranty. So these are all things you have to think about when you hire a mechanic. And I would say too, not all Freightliners are the same. Some Freightliner dealerships are better than others. I love Premier Freightliner. I think they're the best Freightliner in the country. They've done a lot of work for me over the years. They have a quality control system. They have the best mechanics. They have great driver, lounges, leather chairs, big screen TVs, showers, laundry. You could basically live at the dealership if you wanted to. And they're great. I love Premier Freightliner. If my truck broke down, I'm like, oh, there's Premier Freightliner, no question, I'm going to Premier Freightliner. Midwest Freightliner is pretty good. I think that's the Freightliner near Joplin, Missouri. I went in there one time. Very, very good. Freightliner in Columbus, Stoops Freightliner, I think, pretty good. I think they try hard. They're pretty good. Not as good as Premier, but they're not terrible. Northwest Freightliner, I've had mixed result with them. Sometimes they do okay, sometimes they don't, you know, and it's like, well, you know, I can tell the difference between these different Freightliner dealerships. I've had Interstate Power Systems, Detroit Diesel Certified Mechanics, really, really good, very, very good. I put a link in the description. I haven't gone to Stewart and Stevenson before, but they're Detroit Diesel Certified, and I put a link for them in the description. And I put a Locator under Detroit Diesel in the description as well. So those links are all available to you guys if you want to check them out. Try to find Detroit Diesel shop near you. You know, sometimes those guys get very busy and they may have wait lines. You might have to wait a week, 2 weeks, and then you'll be forced to go to a local shop. And it's like, well, I would prefer to go to Detroit Diesel, but they're so damn busy. I have to go somewhere else. You know, that happens sometimes. But you know, it's something that, you know, a mechanic, not necessarily. You know, there are good mechanics, there are bad mechanics, and the best mechanics are Detroit Diesel certified. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.